In this lesson, we're going to talk about another simple concept, that of code blocks and nested statements. Actually, two different ideas in one. So I'm working in the CS-ASP_025 project. You can download it wherever you currently are watching this video or originally downloaded the video. There's a before folder. You can open it up and you can see that we have a default.aspx with a couple of checkboxes, an add button, and a result label. And if you double click the add button just so we can see the code inside of the code behind for the default.aspx page, we can get started here. And the first thing that I want to point out is that there's many layers of code blocks. You've probably already noticed that. Like there's this outermost code block that starts in line 9 and goes to line number 32. In fact, there's a little roll up next to this word namespace, and if you were to click it, everything kind of gets compressed into this line number 8. And so you can see that there is a containment relationship between the namespace and another code block that sits inside of it called the class. All right, this particular class is called the default class. It's the name that we gave the web form whenever we created it when we were adding web forms to our project. And so there's another layer of containment here where this class named default, it has a code block, and inside of there are defined two other code blocks. Each of these are called methods, and these methods have names. The name of this method is page_load, and the name of this method is named add_button_click. And the add_button_click contains code. And so there's another layer of containment. Now, this is when things begin to shift. Inside of this method, you'll notice that there are additional code blocks, but at this point they're not really considered to be a containment relationship between this code block and then this code block and then this code block and then this line of code. Instead, these are called nested statements. We have an if statement nested inside of another if statement nested inside of another if statement. And sometimes you use this in order to perform additional logic, like we got to make sure that this condition is true, and then we'll check for another condition. And if that condition is true, then we'll check for another condition. And if that's true, then we'll perform this. And then there's also the corollary else statements or else ifs that can go along with this. Now, what I would say is that generally you don't want to nest more than 2 levels deep. And so you can usually figure out a way to perform the same work without nesting. The reason why is that nesting can make your code a little bit messy. All right. We'll come back to the ideas of containment with namespaces and classes and methods a little bit later, but I just wanted to throw that out there first. The remainder of this is going to be talking about finding alternatives to creating deeply nested statements in your code base. Again, I just want to reiterate that it makes your code look a little bit messy. It's difficult to understand whenever you have a lot of indentation layers. And if there's so much code that you have to scroll off the page, it's difficult to line up where this if and else and if and all relate to the other ones. So as you get into larger code bases, you'll see that the deeper you nest, the more confusing the code will become. And typically, there are always ways to perform the same work without nesting. So for example, let me just paste in some code here that I have already on my clipboard. Let's just comment this out, and I can perform this same check to make sure that the first checkbox is checked, and the second checkbox is checked, and the third checkbox is checked in order to display a value in the result label. For example, I can just say if the first checkbox is not checked, then we'll call the return keyword, which you'll recall will just kind of shoot us out of the method that we're currently inside of. All right, so the other lines of code won't even be performed. We'll do that again with the second checkbox. If it's not already checked, then the remainder of our logic really doesn't pertain to this condition. So we'll just exit out of the flow of code at the end of the code block and continue on. And then the third checkbox, exactly the same idea. Again, if it's not checked, then we can just avoid the final line of code. But if we made it through all those what are called gated checks or gated if statements, gates, like you close and open a gate, if we have walked through all of those gates, now we can actually perform this line of code, line number 35, which will then put a given value in the result label. So that's one way that you can perform the same logic without deeply nesting your if statements. And then let me kind of give you one more, and these shouldn't be all that new to you. Let me reformat it to make it look good. But here we're simply just doing an if statement all in one line, even though we've broken it up on separate lines. If first checkbox checked and second checkbox checked and third checkbox checked, then result label.text equals they're all checked. Okay, so again, the moral of the story is you should be creative in finding ways to avoid deeply nested code. Now, you can avoid it sometimes. For example, we're going to begin to talk about iteration statements in the very next lesson. And when we look at iteration statements and we need to iterate through things, sometimes that will require that we nest deep. But even in those cases, we'll be able to kind of remove code in such a way that by creating helper methods that we're able to make it more sensible and not so deeply nest one block of code, but split it up into multiple methods and then make calls. Again, we'll talk about that strategy in an upcoming lesson. But if there's a will, there's a way. There's always a way to simplify your code and make it more human readable. All right? And so that's really all I want to talk about. I just wanted to note the relationship between code blocks, especially at the namespace, class, and method level. And then once we get inside of a given method, to note that it kind of changes from containment to a nested relationship between our code blocks. All right, and that we should labor to avoid deeply nested code if we can avoid it. All right, so that's all I wanted to say, and we'll pick it up in the next lesson. Thanks.